Hey everybody, welcome. Hope you're doing well. Today we are going to be talking about the meaning of this keyword hevel in the book of Ecclesiastes. Now this word is typically translated in English translations with some form, some negative, somewhere with a negative connotation. Like we'll see the word vanity or the word meaningless, or those are kind of the two main ones, vanity and meaningless. But the thing is, I don't think that's exactly right. So this is what I wrote my dissertation on, is the meaning of this word hevel in the book of Ecclesiastes. And now you have to understand all of the other, Ecclesiastes refers to Genesis repeatedly throughout the book. Okay, so if you haven't watched my video on references to Genesis in Ecclesiastes, go back and watch that, because that's building this case that this term hevel is actually a reference to Abel. So in Hebrew, the word hevel and the word Abel are exactly the same. They're spelled exactly the same, okay? And both of them, their basic hevel, the basic meaning of hevel is breath or something like that. That's the dictionary denotative meaning, is breath. Now, their metaphorical meanings, it's used to refer to idols in some contexts, okay? Like the book of Jeremiah uses hevel to talk about how idols are insubstantial. They don't do anything, right? They're like a breath of vapor. They just pass away. But in the book of Genesis, obviously it refers to Abel, the character Abel. And Abel is this first person that we find in the Bible who, for him, the retribution principle doesn't really work out, right? So if we read through Genesis and Deuteronomy, there's this concept called the retribution principle or retribution theology. If you haven't watched my video on that, check that out if you're interested in what that means. Basically, the retribution principle is that if you honor God and follow God and do what's right, then you'll be blessed. And if you don't honor God and don't follow God and don't do what's right, then you will be cursed, right? So we see this particularly in the book of Deuteronomy, and we see it kind of played out in the book of Proverbs also, where you have this this kind of ratio of do this, this happens, do that, that happens, right? So if you're wise, you'll be blessed. If you work hard, you'll get food, right? If you run fast, you'll win the race, right? But obviously we know that doesn't always work out. And so we need a way to interpret Proverbs. And we interpret Proverbs by looking at them as principles, not promises, right? So they're not ironclad. So that's one way of dealing with this retribution principle. Another way, Ecclesiastes comes at it and says, look, let's think about Abel, right? And Abel is this guy who honored the Lord. He offered the appropriate sacrifice. He was faithful to God, etc. And what did he get for that? He got murdered by his brother, right? So Cain knocks him down, strikes him down, kills him, and then Cain gets this mark of protection on his life, right? God gives Cain a mark of protection. Cain goes on to live this long life, have children, found a city, and even does this under God's protection, right? And so Abel and Cain are this first example of what happens when the retribution principle doesn't work, right? Sometimes it gets flipped upside down. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve sinned and they were expelled from the garden, right? So the retribution principle works there. That's how it's supposed to happen. You sin, you receive a curse. Cain and Abel is the opposite, right? Abel gets the fruits of wickedness. Cain gets the fruits of righteousness. And this, guys, is what the book of Ecclesiastes is picking up on. So throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, it uses this term Abel or hevel to say, here are some situations in which things don't work out the way they're supposed to, right? So sometimes the fastest runner doesn't win the race. Sometimes the wise person is forgotten. Sometimes in the place of righteousness, there's wickedness or injustice, right? So Ecclesiastes goes throughout, uses this word about 38 times to say, this is hevel, or this is like Abel, this is like Abel, this is like Abel, this is like Abel. These are instances in life in which things are turned upside down, right? Stuff doesn't work out the way it's supposed to. And so Ecclesiastes is using this keyword hevel not to talk about meaninglessness or vanity. He's using it to talk about the world turned upside down. The world, when things happen the way they're not supposed to happen. When the righteous get the rewards of the wicked, and when the wicked get the rewards of the righteous. That's what Ecclesiastes is talking about and wrestling with. And that's why he uses this word Abel, because he's forcing into our minds this narrative, this story of bad things happening to good people and good things happening to bad people, right? And so the author of Ecclesiastes is struggling and wrestling with this idea, and that's what had a significant impact on my own life and figuring out how to deal with injustices and frustrations and when things happen the way they shouldn't happen. And my grandmother died when she was like 60 years old, pretty young, right? She had had her second bout with cancer. She buried 2 husbands already. And she just had a rough go of life, but she was so faithful and loved the Lord so much. You know, there's this moment I remember sitting in her blue Pontiac, 4-door sedan, and she doesn't have any hair, just like a few wisps, right? And she's sitting there singing Amazing Grace, crying. And I'm sitting there in the passenger seat, so angry. I was like 11 or 12 years old, 11, I think. I was so mad, so upset because my grandmother is singing Amazing Grace, singing about how God is good and faithful, and she's dying, right? That's an example of Abel, right? Of things being turned upside down. We see other examples. I'm sure you have an example of this from your own life. We see when things don't work out the way they're supposed to. And Ecclesiastes is a book in the Bible that helps us to wrestle with that. It helps us to wrestle with what do we do when life is turned upside down? What do we do when the righteous get the rewards of wickedness and when the wicked get the rewards of righteousness? And ultimately, Ecclesiastes tells us that we do a few things. We trust God, right? Fear God and keep his commandments. We obey him. We're faithful to him. We love him. He's wiser than us, right? We enjoy the gifts that God has given us. In Ecclesiastes, he talks about food, it talks about work, it talks about wine, and it talks about your spouse. And these are 4 things that we see in the book of Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, that they enjoyed. And Ecclesiastes says, hold on to those things. If God allows you to enjoy them, enjoy them. That you fear God, you trust him, you enjoy the things he's given you, and you try to walk faithfully with him, right? And so it doesn't really answer the question of what we do when life is turned upside down. Ecclesiastes doesn't give us pat answers, but it says, look at Abel. Things didn't go the way they were supposed to go for Abel, like we would think they would go. And yet God is faithful and we trust him. And in the midst of all of this frustration and confusion and injustice that we see in this life, we enjoy these gifts that God has given us as much as possible. And really, that's all we can do. We trust the Lord and we enjoy the gifts he's given us. And so Ecclesiastes doesn't really answer the question for us. It gives us some coping mechanisms, some tools to latch onto as we go through this life. And of course, it gives us a way to wrestle. And that's what I love about Ecclesiastes. And that's what I love about it using this keyword, hevel, throughout the book, is it gives voice to the anxiety and the frustration and the pain that we experience. And man, that's worth something, right? That's worthwhile, and that is helpful, or at least it has been for me. All right, so if you have any questions about the meaning of hevel in Ecclesiastes, or how we see that played out in the life of Abel, or how Ecclesiastes is wrestling with this concept of injustice, please put it in the comments below or shoot me an email. And if you like what you see here, please subscribe. And if you have any suggestions for other topics that we could talk about in the Old Testament, I'd love to hear those.